Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. We are joined once again by Dr. Tomas Bogardus. It has been, we were trying to figure it out, something like 2 years. He freaked out because he saw all this hair on me, which was not here last time. Last time we had a conversation. And we're going to talk about the question that everybody seems to be talking about, at least the past week or so, and that is whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And the reason I wanted to have Dr. Bogardus on is he has a really good paper on this subject. It's an older paper, 2017, something like that. And I think the title is, what is the title? Do Christian? It's like, it's very straightforward.
How to tell whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God.
Yeah. So we'll bring that as a resource into this conversation. I think, of course, we should do a little ground setting, but before we do ground setting, let's do a little catch up. It has been a minute since we've spoken about anything philosophical, but it seems to me that you've been doing a number of projects as usual. So yeah, what have you been up to, and what's I see you have that book coming out somewhat soon, right, on the nature of the sexes?
Yeah, I think that's the main thing. I've been working on that for a couple of years now. So it looks like the book will come out with Routledge in October. And the title is The Nature of the Sexes. And so I try to defend a view about what the sexes are. Mm-hmm. And the view is just roughly that to be male is to be an organism with a body that has the function of producing sperm. And similarly for females, but with regard to ova rather than sperm. So it's sort of, I don't know, it's a view that tries to take biology seriously and give a non-psychological, simple, gamete-based account of the sexes, mm-hmm. and that against its rivals. So yeah, that's what I've been working on. Initially was under contract with another publisher, and then that's, I don't know, I think there were some shenanigans.
I was gonna say, were they didn't want to put their hands on that project?
Yeah, well, I don't know, man. I mean, I'm debating. I'm still debating. It was like a year ago. Yeah, it was about almost exactly a year ago that they pulled out, and I guess I've just been thinking about whether to make it public, because I do, like, on the one hand, I do want to, like, warn other authors, like, you just might want to be
totally
careful with this sort of publisher. Yeah. But then on the other hand, I don't want to be I don't know, be a super squeaky wheel, or I don't like whining or complaining.
I don't take you as a gentleman that typically whines or complains. So if you were to issue a statement like that, it'd be one that I would pay attention to for sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, I haven't decided.
Yeah. Well, think about it.
Yeah. Sort of like just being stoic and, trying to succeed as
in spite of the man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As the best revenge, to succeed. So I just want the book to be successful, and then maybe the publisher will realize, like, oh man, we really blew it, or something like that.
I think that's stellar.
Yeah, we'll see if that happens. So yeah, I guess now I'm just working on a book review of another book that came out recently about the nature of the sexes. It's Augustine Fuentes' book, Sex as a Spectrum. So I'd like to write a review about that, because so far the only reviews I've seen have been, like, absurdly glowing and positive, and I have some more things to say. So I'd like to maybe write that. Yeah, I guess I still have some ideas about epistemology, and maybe one day I'd like to write a book about the nature of knowledge. But yeah, I guess I was surprised in the last few months that it seems like this question about whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God has become popular again. And I don't, to be honest, I don't know why. I remember in 2017 it became popular because that professor at Wheaton got fired for saying, I think her name was Lauricia Hawkins, got fired for saying that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And so a lot of philosophers got agitated about that and wrote papers about how obviously Christians and Muslims do worship the same God. This professor was correct. So she shouldn't be fired. And so that's what got me thinking about it back in 2017.
Yeah.
But for some reason it's all the rage again. Maybe it just comes back every few years. Like fashion too.
I was gonna say like diets, right? There's these trends that, like, Yeah. So,
I'm sure there must be some sort of explanation. I know that, I mean, there's been a lot of like immigration, and especially in Europe recently, of Muslims, maybe in the United States as well. So maybe that's what's bringing it up to people's minds again.
mhm.
Do you know, Pat, why everyone's talking
You
so
know,
good?
I genuinely do not. I don't. I have, but I'll say that I don't keep my eye on these sorts of things very much, and most of the time I ignore whatever the popular conversation of the day is. But this one is really hot right now, and
Yeah.
it bears on matters relevant to this podcast. You know, theories of successful reference and its interesting philosophy. And I know a guy who's written on this and published on it, so I was like, you know what, let's talk about it. I think we should
Yeah.
maybe start with some clarifications, what we mean by worship generally when this question is brought up, what we don't mean, and also like um, what hangs on this debate. Like why does this matter? Why would this be important? Um,
Yeah.
so I could say a few things about it to start. You could. I'll just say a
Yeah.
few. I'll say a few quick things. I think like most people, at least most of the people who um, say yes to that question generally want to say that what they're not saying is that both religions are equally true or valid, or that both forms of worship are equally acceptable to God or equally salvific or anything like that. They usually want to make those immediate clarifications. They're sort of restricting the question to a question about successful reference and what are sort of intentional actions or attitudes or sort of pointing at, right? The object, whether that's just talking about or thinking about or loving or adoring or something like that. I don't know. Maybe there are obviously people who do want to go further than that. You know, various I guess pluralists and stuff like that. But not. I think most of the people that I've read or talked to who want to say yes to the question want to go that far out. Um, so yeah, maybe you have a few thoughts on just some initial ground setting, and then yeah, why does this question? Why is it important? That'd be good to.
Yeah, so as I witness, I mean, right now there's a conflict going on between, I guess, some internet-based Eastern Orthodox bros, ortho bros. I think they're called. I don't know, maybe that's derogatory, but that seems to be a kind of movement on the internet of people joining Eastern Orthodoxy as they understand it. I say that because it looks like the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church both say that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, whereas these online ortho bros are really adamantly opposed to that.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, it's unclear like who they answer to and what theology they're subscribing to, but they describe themselves as Eastern Orthodox. um, And I guess what I've noticed to see them interacting with, especially Roman Catholics online, is if a Roman Catholic says, yes, as a matter of fact, Muslims and Christians do worship the same God, the immediate charge or like expression of revulsion is, oh, so you worship the Muslim God.
Mhm.
So they in something like that way. And I think what they're trying to communicate is like, oh, well, then what would follow is like the Muslims are correct about what God is like and you agree with them or something like that. So I think what's motivating them is probably they have good intentions. It's a kind of desire to maintain doctrinal purity or like avoid some kind of heresy or be good Christians or something like that, like really defend the Christian conception of God. And
Right.
so when you hear somebody say Christians and Muslims worship the same God, they're hearing that as having like serious theological implications, like there's no significant difference between the Muslim conception of God and the Christian conception of God. Maybe
Mhm.
even Muslims are going to be saved or something like that, according to the Christian view. Yeah, so I think they're trying to avoid implications like that, and they think the way to do it is deny that Christians and Muslims are worshiping the same God. And so I think, yeah, one clarification that would be useful at the beginning is, I mean, a knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people have when you ask them, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? I think the initial stage of the debate often goes through this little station here, where somebody says, well, obviously not, because according to Christianity, God's a Trinity. According to Islam, God's not a Trinity. They're like radical Unitarians. There's just one God, no persons, no parts, nothing like that. So they conclude, well, that means that the gods are different. And so I think what they're saying is, obviously, God, as understood by Christians, is different from. I guess this is a tendentious way of putting it. I shouldn't even put it this way. They should say like, I was going to say God as understood by Muslims, but then that presupposes that it's the same God. So I guess they wouldn't put it that way. They would just say what Christians are directing their worship to is a Trinity. That's like what they have in mind when they're worshiping is a Trinity. Most Christians anyway. What Muslims have in mind is decidedly not a Trinity. In fact, they reject that doctrine of a Trinity. So they think there's just no way that like those acts of worship could be hitting the same target, could be arriving at the same reference, could be directed at the same thing. Yeah, so I think that's often that's the initial stage of the argument. And then I think it is worthwhile to point out, often like the response to that is, it is possible for two groups of people to be talking about the same thing and directing all sorts of intentional attitudes towards the same thing, even though they have radically different ideas about what that thing is like. So just one example is, Democrats have one idea of what Donald Trump is like. Republicans have another idea of what Donald Trump is like. These are very different ideas, and yet they're talking about the same guy, right? There's the same object that they're talking about. And maybe a better example, and this I think is probably the best argument that I can think of for the same God conclusion. Just point out, I think it's worth pointing out that Muslims and Christians are talking about the same Jesus. I think that's pretty clear.
Right.
Like when Muslims say Jesus didn't die on the cross, like I'm pretty sure they're talking about that first century Palestinian guy. Well, I shouldn't say Palestinian, the first century guy from Palestine. They say he did not die on the cross. They also say he was not the Son of God. And it's pretty clear who they're talking about. They're talking about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think the Christians should admit the Muslims are saying false things about that guy. They're not talking about somebody else. Okay, so there's an example of how Muslims have one conception of Jesus, merely a man, just a prophet, did not die, was not the second person of the Trinity, etc. That's the Muslim conception of Jesus. It's very different from the Christian conception of Jesus, and yet we're both talking about the same Jesus. Okay, so to be honest, I haven't seen any of these online Orthodox folks address that kind of concern.
Yeah.
A second sort of point is, so you can do the same thing with Muhammad, right? So Muslims have one conception of Muhammad, prophet sent by God, actually interacted with Gabriel on this mountain of light or whatever. Christians have a very different conception of Muhammad. Not a prophet, not sent by God, did not communicate with God. The Quran is not a divine transmission, not divine revelation. So super different conceptions of Muhammad, and yet incompatible conceptions, right? There's no way both of these could be true. And yet they're both talking about the same guy, right? Okay, so now that we admit that those things are possible, the question is, why isn't the same thing happening with the divine names, with names like God and Allah? I mean, my understanding is that Allah, as it's used even by contemporary Christians who speak Arabic, Christians in the Middle East, they'll use that word Allah as like a generic divine name, like God, the way that we use God. So I think my understanding is Arab-speaking Christians will use Allah to refer to God. And my understanding is in the historical context when Muhammad introduced his, in my view, false religion, he was borrowing a word that was already in circulation, being used by Christians and Muslims, and he intended to join that name using practice and say, like, I'm talking about the same Allah. Yes, I'm talking about that God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then the question is just, how could it be that Muslims and Christians are talking about the same Jesus, talking about the same Muhammad, and yet not talking about the same God?
All right. What could principal difference be there, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's not really an argument. I guess that's not an argument. That's just a question, right? That's just
Good one.
I just
It's
asked.
a question that should get people thinking. I think it shows that, like, on a superficial level, somewhat superficial, I guess, like there's an obvious yes and like to some people it will be obviously yes or obviously no, depending how you're thinking about it. Like on a very popular level, if I think a lot of people say, do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? They'll say obviously not, just because they realize that the conceptions are different, that the religions are different.
Yeah.
But like for people we kind of hang out with, I think the more knee-jerk reaction, because philosophers think about weird things like theories of reference, the answer is obviously obviously yes, right?
Yeah.
Like what's the big deal here, right? So, but when these kind of like people intermix, and one person saying obviously no, and another person saying obviously yes, you gotta slow down and try to make these distinctions and clarifications. But but even among the philosophers, there's disagreements. There's smart people who say no, they're definitely not, and we're going to get into some of those subtleties and nuances here, I think, in just a minute. Sorry, you wanted to add something else, Thomas? Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, like, so far, I think we've recapped like the debate as one often observes it at the popular level and among people who are sort of philosophically interested but not super well trained in philosophy language. They usually get this far in the debate. And so I think what's just worth pointing out is so far what we've covered is it looks like when it comes to the name Jesus and the name Mohammed, what we've noticed is what a name refers to is not determined by the information that you associate with the name, the conception you have of the name, the description that you associate with the name. Because Christians, when they think about who Jesus is, they'll have things like Son of God, died, rose from the dead, Savior of the world. They'll have they'll have that information in their mental file folder, so to speak.
Right.
Muslims use the name Jesus, and it sure looks like they're talking about the same guy, but they have very different information. And from a Christian's point of view, the Muslim has a lot of false information in his or her mental file folder. So they have information like not Son of God, just a prophet, didn't die, wasn't raised from the dead, not Savior of the world. Okay, and yet, nevertheless, like Muslims still manage to refer to Jesus with the name Jesus. Okay, so that just shows that when it comes to names, like Jesus and Muhammad, proper names, the proper names are not just abbreviated descriptions. They're not just synonymous with some description that you associate with the name.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if I need to repeat myself, but we got the name Jesus, and we've got this long description about what we think Jesus is like. Something doesn't have to satisfy the description that we associate with the name in order for the name to refer. And just witness what's happening with the Muslims. Like they use the name Jesus. Their description doesn't really match Jesus very well from our perspective, and from the perspective of reality. And yet never the name refers. Okay, same thing happens with the name Donald Trump. Okay, so then we just need to. So we've dismissed a view that philosophers call descriptivism, according to which proper names are abbreviated definite descriptions. All right, so so far we've just recapitulated that bit of the philosophical debate. Descriptivism is false when it comes to proper names. So I guess the sort of frontiers of the debate, and this is the part that I'm not really super sure about, is if you want to say that Muslims and Christians don't worship the same God, and yet they refer to the same Jesus and they refer to the same Muslim, you've got to find some disanalogy, something that happened with the divine names, something that's true of the divine names that isn't true of the names Jesus and Muhammad. Okay, so what could be the difference? And one difference could just be, you might think, okay, proper names like Jesus and Muhammad, they are not abbreviated definite descriptions, but the divine names are. The divine name, descriptivism is true of the divine names for some reason. Divine names really are just synonymous with some long description, so that if something doesn't meet all the information in the description, then it couldn't be the referent of that name. You could say that. Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to point out that we, before this conversation, talked about a recent paper by Joshua. I'm not sure how his last
Dr.
name.
Joshua Sijuwati. Yeah, he's been a guest on the show before.
Yeah, so he has been working on a paper, and I guess it's now forthcoming, about whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And he seems to think in the paper, I mean, he tries in the beginning of the paper to say, like, I'm going to set aside philosophy of language and settle this with metaphysics, which frankly I think is a mistake because we're wondering about reference and like what the divine names refer to. And I don't think you can settle that with metaphysics. But he, in the paper, pretty explicitly makes it clear that he's assuming that the divine names refer, if they refer at all, they refer to the information that you associate with the name. And I can just read, let me read a quote for you. I
Yeah.
highlighted it in the paper. Yeah, so this is not on the published version of the paper. I'm reading the penultimate draft. So it's on page 9 of that penultimate draft. It's in section 3.
I'll link
The
this in
section's
the
titled "The
description.
Philosophical Argument from a." All right, so section 3, the philosophical argument from essential differences. Section 3.1, informal presentation of the argument. And so what he does is he tries to lay out the so-called real definition. I love real definitions. I think that's great. I like where his head's at with real definitions. So he tries to lay out the real definition of God according to Christians, and it's just what you'd expect. So it has to do with the Trinity, right? There's going to be information about the Trinity in there. Okay, and he's going to do something similar with what he calls the Muslim God. It's going to say like not triune. Okay, obviously nothing could satisfy the real definition of the Christian God and also the real definition of the Muslim God. Nothing in reality could both be triune and also not triune at the same time. Okay, so far so good. That's right. Yeah, nobody's saying that there's one object out there and it is exactly as the Muslims think and it's exactly as the Christians think. Nobody would believe that. That'd be a contradiction. Okay, but here's the quote I wanted to read to you. So he says that the right side of the definition of the Christian God, the one that lists all the information about the Trinity, quote, captures the core of the conciliar view. Okay, so that's the core of what like the church councils have said. Continuing the quote, the word God refers to the Father whose essence, whose very whatness, is to be the uncaused source of the other divine persons. Okay, so that's the end quote. So that's just his way of saying God refers to something that has Trinitarian properties, something that has Trinitarian aspects. Okay, so what he's assuming there is the word God is going to refer, if it refers at all, as Christians use the word God, if it refers at all, it's going to refer to something that's a Trinity. So if it turns out that Islam's true and there is no Trinity, then the word God's not going to refer.
Right.
Okay. And similarly, in the other direction, Muslims are using the word Allah, and if it refers at all, it's referring to a non-Trinity. And so if it turns out that Christianity is true and Islam's false, Muslims have been referring to nothing, I guess. The name has just been empty. Okay, so he doesn't use the word descriptivism, but that just is descriptivism about divine names. He's saying, as Christians use the word God, it just is an abbreviated definite description. And then he gives us the description. Okay. Yeah, so that's what I think is false. And I can't see why it would be true for divine names, but false for names like Jesus and Muhammad, and false for names like Donald Trump. Yeah, the only, I don't know, you'd have to tell a story about why the divine names are different from ordinary proper names. And I guess what you could say is the word God, and I guess I don't speak Arabic, but maybe this goes for the word Allah as well. These are kind of almost like titles. So sort of like mom or dad, the way we use those words in English, mom and dad. So mom just means I don't know, you might think it just means something like my mother or something like that. And dad means something like my father. And something like that is happening with God, because we have like little g God, right? And we can say like the gods of the nations are demons. I guess that somewhere one of the Psalms says that. And we can say they worship false gods. The Babylonian gods were not real or were demons. And we use like little g gods there. Whereas when we talk about like our God, the God. We use like capital G, God. So it's behaving something like mom and dad. And I should just say, like, I'm just speculating with you now, Pat. I'm just thinking out loud here, and I could be wrong.
Please. Yeah, no,
But
this is great.
this is the way I was thinking about it. And if that's right, so there is kind of a relationship between mom and a certain office or role or title, like being my mother. If you're my mother, then you get the name mom. If you're my father, you get the name dad. But still, and so similarly, like if you're the true God or if you're our God, then you get the title capital G God.
Mm-hmm.
But still, even if that's right, and I think that is right, like I think those words, mom, dad, God, still function very much like proper names. They're still what philosophers call rigid designators. They
Right.
refer, yeah, so if they refer to anything, they refer to that thing in every possible world in which that
Mm-hmm.
thing exists. So just as we can say something like this, so I'm just going to use a simple example. We've got the name Donald Trump, and you've got a certain kind of information associated with that name. Maybe is he the 40? What number president are we on? Is he the 45th president?
Yep.
Okay, so 45th president. 45th president, kind of an orange tint to him, and so on.
Not just, yeah,
So
also
that
47th, also 47th, should add, yeah.
okay,
45th
45th and
yeah.
47th. Okay, great. 45th and 47th, bit of an orange tint. Issued a lot of executive orders, having a feud with Elon Musk. Okay, so this is like the information we associate with Donald Trump. We can still reasonably say things like Donald Trump might have never done any of those things, right? So we can imagine a possible world in which Donald Trump exists, and yet he doesn't have an orange tint. He was never president.
Never
No feud with
45th
Elon
president.
Musk. Yeah, he just he just lived a simple life. Owning some property in New York or something.
Became a commentator for the WWE, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, or just, I mean, he could have died young. We can imagine a world in which he died in infancy, right? That's possible. Donald Trump could have died in infancy. All right. And then he wouldn't have satisfied like any of the information that we associate with the name. Okay, so that shows that like Donald Trump, the name, seems to be sticking to that guy, no matter what else is going on with the description. Like even if he's not president, not orange, doesn't know Elon Musk. Okay, so that shows that like the name is a rigid designator. It sticks to that guy in every world in which that guy exists. Okay, so doesn't the same thing happen with God, with the word God? Can't we imagine a world in which, I guess, so I think this happened for me. I converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism, and I think I like changed my conception of God. I realized like God is not the way I thought he was. Turns out God is a little bit different.
Yes.
Okay.
Same.
And even now as a Roman Catholic, I can still wonder, like, are the Protestants right about God? Is that the way the world is? Could God really be, I don't know. What's the major difference? Okay, so
Maybe
could God
deny divine simplicity or something like that, right? Or
yeah, or he didn't really institute the church and give Peter the keys or whatever. Maybe God didn't really intend to do that. So yeah, we can, whatever information you associate with God, or at least a lot of the information you associate with God, I don't think it could have turned out. So there's some information that's like absolutely essential. Similarly with Donald Trump, I don't think it could have turned out that Donald Trump actually, we've come to find out the name refers to a street sign in New York or something like that.
Yeah,
like that
or an ostrich or something like that. There's limits for sure, right? Yeah,
there are limits. So there are some like essential properties of Donald Trump that have to be met in order for the name to refer to him. But those aren't typically the properties that like you associate with the name. It's certainly not being president. It's not having the orange tint. It's not knowing Elon Musk. But there are some like sine qua non properties. Like without these properties, the name just can't refer. So similarly with God, like I don't think we could find out that God is actually a guy in Wisconsin or something, and we've all been confused this whole time. Yeah, that can happen. Or I think in that paper I wrote, I mentioned that John, it was his name, John Allegro. He wrote a book, The Sacred Cross and the Mushroom, or something like that.
Oh yeah, one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, where his hypothesis is the name Jesus Christ was actually introduced by the early church to refer to a hallucinogenic mushroom. and they were just kind of like trying to keep it on the down low, and so
Right.
they called that the Christ or something like that. Okay, so I think if we found out that that was true, what we would find out is there really was no Jesus, right? We wouldn't say, "Oh, wow, it turns out Jesus." I mean,
Jesus
definitely
was a
Jesus.
mushroom. Yeah, yeah.
Jesus exists. It just turns out he was a psychedelic mushroom this whole time. No, I think what we would find out is there never was a Jesus. There was just
That's
this
right.
other
Yeah.
thing that people called Jesus. Okay, so I think we can try to run a similar kind of test with the name God, the word God, to figure out whether it's a rigid designator. And so we can't ask questions like, could God exist even if he was a mushroom, or could God exist even if he was a guy in Wisconsin? Because no, that wouldn't be God. Yeah, so that's just to say, like, but the same thing would happen with Donald Trump. Like, if we ask, could Donald Trump exist and yet just be a street sign in the Bronx?
Mhm.
No, that wouldn't be Donald Trump. Okay, but it looks like the word God is going to refer to things that kind of could refer to things that violate our conception of God, at least a little bit. So that happened when I moved from Protestantism to Catholicism.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and so then I guess the question is,
Well, it
is
also
the same
happened for me
true
when
with
I
this
sort
one?
of moved just from say being a bare sort of theist to a Catholic myself, right?
Yeah,
So one of the things that you should think about the proposal that we're looking at is what would the implications be, not just for Muslims, but say successful natural theologians, if you think they exist, or the Jewish people. Um,
yeah,
and I think that they're not great, right? Uh huh. Mm-hmm.
yeah. I think that's right. And I just saw somebody point out recently that Saint Paul, when he's given his autobiographies in one of his letters, he says something like, I was, raised a Jew, educated a Jew. And I think he says something which implies that many Jews, including himself, are just as zealous about God as any Christian or something like that. So he seems to say something that implies that Jews and Christians worship the same God.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's no surprise at all.
Right.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
I mean,
And I
Jesus
think that's
definitely says
exactly
things.
what you should want to say, say at least in
Yeah.
that context, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's why we put those like two testaments together. They seem to tell like a consistent story about God. Okay, so I guess that's just another example to help people see that, I mean, Jewish people are talking about God, even though they have a radically different conception. Yeah, and I guess if I were to ask myself this like, if I were to run this counterfactual through my head, like, what if Judaism were true and Christianity were false? Could God still exist? And I think the answer is yes. So I think again, this just shows that like God, the word God is behaving a lot like a proper name. It's like picking out the same object in every world in which that object exists. If I'm describing a scenario in which God could plausibly exist, the word God's going to refer to that thing. Similarly
Mm-hmm.
with Donald Trump, I can describe a situation in which Donald Trump exists, might be radically different from how I think of him, but as long as he's there,
Mm-hmm.
the name Donald Trump refers to him. The name Donald Trump in my mouth now, describing that scenario. Of course, we can imagine a world in which nobody ever speaks English and he was never given a name Donald Trump or something like that. So in that world, nobody calls him Donald Trump. But nevertheless, we describing the world, when we use the name Donald Trump, it's going to pick out that guy. Okay, similarly, that seems to be the way that the divine names work.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing happens with mom and dad. Like I can imagine a world, I can ask myself this question, like, speaking of my mom, I could say like, could mom have not had any children at all? Yeah, that's possible. Mom could have failed to have children. So I'm not saying like my mom or like the mother of me. I'm just using that name mom, and imagine me talking to mom and saying like, mom, could
Mm-hmm.
it have happened that you didn't have any children at all? I think she'd say yeah. And I think that is a possible world. So I'm
Yeah.
imagining a world in which my mother never had any children, and I'm wondering, where's mom in this world? Is mom in this world? Oh yeah, she's right there. She's the one having no children, right? Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
even though she's not a mother in that world, it doesn't matter. The name mom, the title mom, still describes her as I use the name in my mouth. Still describes her. Okay,
Right. Picks her out.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think yeah. So it looks like, although God isn't your run of the mill proper name like Jesus or Mohammed or Donald Trump, I think people are going to be offended that I'm using those three names together.
Well, got to keep the
I'm not trying
conversation
to tell you
a little
anything. I'm not
spicy.
trying to
Yeah.
tell you anything about my political views. I'm just using a name that we're all familiar with.
Right.
I don't think that Donald Trump is divine by any means. Just wanted to put that out. Neither is Muhammad. Okay, but yeah. So although like God, the name God is not your typical proper name, and it functions more like mom and dad. Nevertheless, like I think it is still a rigid designator. It's still picking out the same thing in every possible world in which that thing exists. Yeah, and it will do so even if our conceptions are radically mistaken. Okay, so I think that's worth pointing out. So if we're going to find a disanalogy between the divine names and names like Jesus and Muhammad, it's not going to be that the divine names are not rigid designators. That's not what it. So I think Joshua Sijuwade, as I say that right, I don't think he's right that the divine names are just abbreviated definite descriptions. No, that's not right. They are rigid designators, just like ordinary proper names. So all of Kripke's arguments would still help us see that descriptivism is false with respect to the divine names.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me turn to something that I think is more promising. Although again, like my position is I just don't know whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. It's really super complicated.
Yeah,
I guess,
what we should have pointed out at the beginning, and is that your paper answers, well, it depends, and you talk about how
yeah,
reference drift
I
and
try to
stuff can
give the
happen.
reader.
Mm-hmm.
I try to give the reader a test. I say, here's the test you run.
Yep.
Good luck. I hope it works for you.
Have a good day.
When I run the test, like I get kind of unclear results, so I don't totally know. So my view is, yeah, it's not super clear to me either way whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. I think probably the truth of the matter is some Christians and Muslims worship the same God, and probably some don't. I think that's probably the answer. Some do and some don't. And I'm sorry, that's
a safe sounding
not a
position
nice,
to me.
neat, clean answer. But I think that's probably the fact of the matter. And I am aware that Vatican II has declared that they have said things that entail that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. I am aware of that. I think what might be happening is Vatican II, the authors of those documents of Vatican II, use the word God in such a way that they are among the people who are using the word God in such a way that it co-refers with the divine names as Muslims use it. But there still nevertheless may be Christians who use the divine names in a different way. So let me just give you an example, and this will help illustrate what I think is the problematic sort of phenomenon that complicates this whole issue. The problematic phenomenon is called reference shift, and it's just when words change what they refer to. It happens with proper names, and it happens with ordinary like nouns. So I'll give you an example of both. So the name Santa Claus, if you trace back like its ancestry, it traces back to names for Saint Nicholas, right? I mean, you can hear it. Santa Claus, Sinterklaas in, I think, Danish or Dutch or something. It was called like Sinterklaas. That's where we got Santa Claus. But even like Saul Kripke was aware. Here, I'll just read a little quote that I brought up from Saul Kripke.
Good.
If people have not read Naming and Necessity, like when people ask me what should I read to get, if you could only recommend like one book in contemporary analytic philosophy, what would it be? I would say Naming and Necessity by Saul Kripke.
Yeah, foundational.
I would just read that, and it's not even like super duper technical. It is like you got to use your brain when you read it, but it's not. There's not a ton of like logical machinery going on. It's not really overwhelming in that way. But a lot of these ideas that people have of the reference of a name tracing back to the original use of the name, so that, the fact that Muhammad used the name Allah and he got it from Christians and Jews in his neighborhood, and their use of the name traces back to the God of Abraham. So the idea is like, look, Muhammad joined this like historical chain of uses.
He's one of those links in the chain back to the original sort of
link
baptism
all the way
event, as you
back
call it.
of Abraham. So even if Muhammad had radically mistaken ideas about who God was like, he joined that chain, and so he gets to refer to the originating use of the name, whatever that name referred to. Okay, so even Saul Kripke, who that sort of view is attributed to Saul Kripke, says this. Hold on. Shoot. There it is. Yep, there it is. So this is on page
The longer you
93
take,
of...
the better my monetization is. So please don't rush.
Oh, okay. Make sure you watch until the end.
Stay tuned.
It's going to be a big
Don't
reveal
don't
at the
click
end of
out
this
early,
video.
right? Yeah.
Okay, so on page 93, this is what Kripke says in Naming a Necessity. On the edition that I have, I think this is the 1980 version. Okay, but just search for this phrase. Okay, so he says, obviously the name is passed on from link to link. But of course, not every sort of causal chain reaching from me to a certain man will do for me to make a reference. There may be a causal chain from our use of the term Santa Claus to a certain historical saint, but still the children, when they use this name, by this time probably do not refer to that saint. So other conditions must be satisfied in order to make this into a really rigorous theory of reference. And I just want to read the next line because it's kind of funny. He says, I don't know that I'm going to do this because first, I'm sort of too lazy at the moment. Okay, and then he says, secondly, rather than giving a set of necessary and sufficient conditions which will work for a term like reference, I want to present just a better picture than the picture presented by the received views. Okay, so he's very clear that he's not giving us like a rigorous theory. And he's aware of like a troubling kind of case, the name Santa Claus. Yeah. So we might join a certain name using practice, and we intend to use the name in the same way that other people are using the name. And maybe they've all done the same thing when they use the name. As we go back along the whole historical chain, everybody who picks up the name intends to use it in the way that other people are using it. But nevertheless, like names can shift reference. So that's one example. It looks like it happened with Santa Claus. So Gareth Evans gives similar cases, and I have
the Madagascar case and a few other ones. Yeah.
So I'll just read those two cases. And then I had another case. So don't let me forget a case about the word corn, because that one's relevant. Okay, that's going to be relevant for Vatican II. But here's what Gareth Evans says. So it looks like this was the history of the name Madagascar. Everyone knows what Madagascar is, right? That's an island off the coast of Africa. But it looks like we got that name. If you trace back the ancestry of that name, it traces back to like a garbled version of a word for a part of the mainland of Africa. And in fact, if you trace the etymology of Madagascar back, it looks like it dovetails with the etymology of Mogadishu. Mogadishu, Madagascar, Mogadishu, Madagascar. You can kind of see like, oh yeah, maybe those do have a common ancestor. So Mogadishu is part of Somalia, right? It's like part of the African mainland. Madagascar is names the island off the coast. So it looks like what happened is there was some sort of confusion between, so here's what Gareth Evans says on page 196 of the Causal Theory of Names. He says, in the case of Madagascar, hearsay report of Malay or Arab sailors misunderstood by Marco Polo has had the effect of transferring a corrupt form of the name of a portion of the African mainland to the great African island. Okay, so actually this is Evans quoting a book by Isaac Taylor. So Isaac Taylor in this book from 1898 is telling us where we got the name Madagascar. And so the story is, and this looks like probably what happened, Marco Polo seemed to misunderstand what the name refers to. He met some Arab or Malay sailors, and they were talking about parts of Africa, land masses in that area, and he heard a name that was like some version, some ancestor of Madagascar, and mistakenly thought they were talking about the island, but really they were talking about part of the African mainland. So Marco Polo intended to join that name using practice, intended to use the name as the others were using it, but he sort of splintered off, and people who use the name in this, like joining the Marco Polo practice, have come to refer to the island, because Marco Polo had like two kind of incompatible intentions in his mind. He wanted to use the name as the other people were using it, but he mistakenly thought that they were using it to refer to the island. And so eventually, because that misunderstanding became so prominent and widespread, the island became the referent of the name, at least as we use the name.
He had
Okay,
the
so
shift
something,
occur. Yeah.
yeah. And so what's interesting is like it wasn't intentional. It's not like Marco Polo was like, I know what you all mean by Madagascar, but I want to use it as a name for that island. So he didn't do that. He really intended to join the practice and use it. He wanted to defer to previous uses. But unfortunately, yeah, he also thought they were talking about the island. And so the way that Gareth Evans diagnoses this is we as a language using community have a certain body of information associated with every name, a kind of like file folder, and we shove scraps of information about what we take the referent to be into this mental file folder. So we've got this name Donald Trump, and as he kind of rose to fame, we started shoving information in there, like owns a lot of buildings, pretty rich guy, has gone through bankruptcy a few times, serial monogamist, etc. So we're shoving information. Okay, president, felon, president again. Okay, so we're putting information in this mental file folder. And so what Gareth Evans says is, look, if you want to know what a name refers to, do not just look out into the world to see what best fits the information in the mental file folder.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a kind of descriptivism, and we know that that's false. So we're not just looking for best fit, because it could be that a lot of the information in the mental file folder is misinformation, is mistaken information.
Right.
Okay, so on Gareth Evans' view, if you want to know what a name refers to, and you don't just look to like the original source of the name, what the name was used to dub or baptize originally, because that's not going to allow for reference shifts. Like we've got cases like Santa Claus and Madagascar that refute that. Okay, so rather what we're doing is we want to look for the dominant source of the information that's in the mental file folder, that's in what he calls the dossier of the name, the dominant source of the information. And so what happened with Marco Polo is there was a name using practice. I don't know what word they were using, some ancestor of Madagascar. And it was full of information about Mogadishu, about that part of the African mainland. That part of the African mainland was the dominant source of information in the mental file folder. So at that time, the name referred to Mogadishu, or referred to that part of the African mainland. Okay, but then Marco Polo came along. He intended to use the name in the same way, and so he's adding scraps of information in there. He's like, I've got some more information about Madagascar. But mistakenly, accidentally, he's adding information about the island. Okay, so when he first starts doing that, the island is not the dominant source of information. So he is saying false things about Mogadishu if he says like, hey, Madagascar's an island. When he first starts using the word, he's saying something false.
Yes.
Because what he's saying is that part of the African mainland is an island. That's false. But as he continues doing this, and as he and his buddies and his linguistic descendants, as they like keep adding information about the island into this mental file folder, eventually the name shifts reference and it starts referring to the island. Okay, did that make sense? Because that's pretty crucial.
Made sense to me, but I read your paper, so it's familiar territory. Yeah.
Here's another example from Gareth Evans. So he says, this is just right below the Madagascar example, page 196 of the Causal Theory of Names. He says, quote, 2 babies are born, and their mothers bestow names upon them. A nurse inadvertently switches them, and the error is never discovered. It will henceforth undeniably be the case that the man universally known as Jack is so called because a woman dubbed some other baby with the name. Okay, so we got 2 babies born. This one's called Jack originally in the hospital. This baby's Jack. Can you see my hand? Okay, I'm not looking at the video. Okay, so this one's Jack. But then a nurse inadvertently switches them. Okay, so now Jack's over here, but this baby goes home with the mom who named her baby Jack, right? So this baby over here, my left hand, goes home with that mom. And so this baby starts being called Jack. So although this baby was the one that was originally dubbed Jack and maybe even baptized Jack, like eventually, since this one goes home with the mom's dossier associated with the name Jack starts getting filled with information about that baby. the new baby. And
Right.
so eventually, it's just like the Madagascar case. Eventually, the name starts referring to this baby. And that
Right.
seems right. Like if you found out that this happened, yeah, I guess, I mean, if you found out that this happened to you, maybe, and you were originally named, I don't know, so suppose it happens to me, and I find out I was originally named Jeff or something like that. I guess what we would find out in that case is Tomas Bogardus was originally called Jeff, even though there's like another baby out there who was baptized Thomas. Nevertheless, like that name Thomas refers to me because like I've spent so much time being called Thomas. Like the mental file folder associated with that name, that particular instance of that name Thomas, has been filled with information about me. Okay, so it's come to refer to me. Okay, so before we get to the corn example, I just wanted to say that might have happened with the divine names. But I guess the difficult thing is trying to explain why it didn't happen with names like Jesus, as the Muslims use the name, or why it didn't happen with the name Muhammad, but it did happen with the divine names.
Yeah.
So what would have to happen is something like this. What happened with Santa Claus is there was this name using practice, and we had this mental file folder, this dossier filled with information about St. Nicholas. But then people came along and just started telling stories. And I guess what we'd have to say is these people weren't super concerned about who these stories were about. So they just thought like, yeah, let's just tell a fiction about St. Nicholas. Let's just tell a story. And so we tell poems like the night before Christmas or whatever it's called. And we start kind of like importing information about Norse mythology. And we make this character into, I guess he was originally like a kind of elf. He didn't just supervise elves, but I think he was an elf.
He was himself an elf. Interesting. I did not
know
that.
Yeah, he lives at the North Pole, okay, etc. So somehow the name shifted reference. So what must have happened is the file folder associated with the name Santa Claus got polluted by information that wasn't about any particular person because there is no Santa Claus. It was about nobody in particular. It was about like a fictional character.
Yeah.
That seems to be the story. So the myth makers, the storytellers, the tale spinners weren't super concerned about who the story was about. They didn't mean to tell stories about St. Nicholas. Yeah, they just were just telling stories, right? They didn't really seem concerned about who it was about. And then eventually, because they polluted the mental file folder so much with this information, eventually the name shifted reference. So I guess something similar, if Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God, it's because something similar happened. And when Muhammad came along and Muslims after him for many centuries, what you'd have to say is they did the same thing to the dossier for the divine name God and Allah as happened with the name Santa Claus. So they just started putting in information that admittedly was misinformation, but it wasn't misinformation about God. It was information, and they weren't super concerned with who it was about or something like that. They were just kind of telling stories. And so the best explanation of what happened is they weren't talking about God anymore. They were talking about some creature of fiction. Okay, so that's what you'd have to say. But the puzzle is, why didn't that happen with Jesus, right? The name Jesus. So I guess that would be the challenge. If somebody really wants to defend the view that Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God, they'd have to not just appeal to the possibility of reference shift. They'd have to explain like why it's plausible to think that happened, but also why it doesn't seem to have happened with Jesus.
Yeah,
the name
right.
Jesus. Okay, so that's the challenge. So I guess I'll just quickly add that some people, including me, I'm kind of inclined to think that Mormons don't worship the same God that Christians do. Whereas when it comes to Muslims, like I think it's less clear. But I would have thought that Mormons, it's like a clearer case. And if there's a difference, I guess it's because like it seemed, I don't know. And this is just a historical question is the problem. And like
there's just some historical details that are like they're certainly not particularly handy for me right now, but could be just difficult to get at in general, right?
Yeah, philosophers are not very good at answering these sorts of historical questions. But it seems like Muhammad he seemed pretty committed to saying like, Jews and Christians in my neighborhood, I've got some new information about your God. Whereas Joseph Smith seemed much more like a creative mind. He had a much more active imagination. I'm pretty sure it's like a historical fact that he wrote like other sorts of like riffs on biblical stories. Like he was into like writing, like I guess fan fiction is what we call it. Like he was into writing fan fiction. So he was just kind of that sort of person who was just like into weaving stories and telling stories. So it's a little bit more, it seems a little bit more like the Santa Claus case,
Like
where
you,
you've got
yeah,
some
you can have a
people who
parallel
join
to
in the
Santa,
Santa
sure.
Claus stories, and they're like, I've got some fan fiction about Santa Claus. I'm going to put him at the North Pole.
Mhm.
Okay. And if they do this enough, Santa Claus shifts reference. Okay. Joseph Smith shows up, and maybe at the beginning he did obviously intend to like engage the Christians of his time and say like, all of your churches are abominations. I've got the real story.
Mhm.
But it seems like, I don't know, the way that he was telling the stories and inventing the stories seems importantly different from what Muhammad was doing. Even though I think they were both like radically mistaken, I think that there might have been a difference in quality, a different kind of tale spinning that would
Mhm.
explain why Mormons aren't worshiping the same God, and there was a reference shift in that case.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I don't know. That I admit that's very sketchy and pretty speculative, and I could be wrong, because I guess even in the case of the Mormons, like, oof, what do you think, Pat? Are they talking about Jesus when they say like Jesus visited the New World? Like, I think they are talking about Jesus, aren't they?
Yeah, no, this is, I mean, this is difficult. I agree with all the principles, right? But there's vagueness issues here.
Yeah.
There's real vagueness issues that I'm
Maybe
hesitant
maybe
to.
this is the problem. Oh, sorry to interrupt you, Pat. Go
No,
ahead.
I'm just hesitant to wade into.
Yeah.
But again, like it's not this vagueness with beards, right? But it's not hard to say like, yo, the lead singer of ZZ Top definitely has one, right? When you're clearly on one side of it or the other. I'm not going to reference myself, of course, or you,
Yeah.
um, but like there's things like they're edge cases, right? They're hard and there's just certain but as you said, historical details that certainly I'm not privy to
Yeah.
that I would want to be before I made any sort of statement on that matter, right? Yeah.
Well, I just had another thought, and again, just thinking out loud here. So, I'm glad we're not like recording this and publishing this for all time or
Yeah,
anything.
for everyone to see. Well, yeah.
Yeah, but here's another thought. So, yeah, one way to go is to try to explain, or so if you wanted to say that Mormons are worshiping a different God, but Muslims and Christians are worshiping a different God, one way to try to make that work is explain how there was a difference in kind between the storytelling that Joseph Smith was involved in versus the storytelling that Muhammad was involved in. Um, okay, that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is,
Seems definitely plausible to me, for sure, right? Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, I wonder if it matters that like it could be that Muhammad really didn't think that he was making this up. If you thought that was the case, like he really believed that he was getting a revelation. Whereas if you think that Joseph Smith kind of knew all along that he was making this up, I wonder if
Right,
that's
right,
a relevant
right.
difference.
I think it could
I don't.
be. Yeah.
Hey, avenues for future research. But
Yeah,
here's
there we
something
go.
else.
That's I'm going to end the
Yeah,
paper right there.
yeah. Here's another possibility. You could appeal to this kind of sine qua non properties. So before, when we were thinking about whether the name God is a rigid designator, we asked like, could it turn out that God is just like a guy in his basement in Wisconsin? Could it turn out that God is a mushroom? Could it turn out that Donald Trump is a street sign? And the answer seems to be like, no, some information in the file folder is sort of elevated to a status where if something doesn't meet that information, there's just no way the name refers to it. And there are some clear examples of names that function this way, like Jack the Ripper. Like, here's something that couldn't happen. It, we couldn't find out that, oh, Jack the Ripper exists, but he never actually committed any crimes. He never murdered anybody. That
Mhm,
couldn't
mhm.
happen, right? Because it's kind of like essential to the name that whoever Jack the Ripper is committed crimes. He committed a lot of murders in London in the late 1800s or whatever. Similarly, I give this example in the paper. inspired by a case by Keith Donnellan, Donnellan, Donnellan. Oof, I think it's Donnellan. Oh boy, I should know that.
Something.
Yeah. So imagine that the leader of the teetotalers union is told, "Oh no, somebody at our party is drinking a martini." So this is supposed to be a union of people opposed to alcohol,
Mhm.
but we're told somebody's drinking a martini. Okay, imagine we introduce a name. We're like, for ease of reference, let us refer to the person drinking the martini as Mr. Martini
Marty
or
Martini.
Marty Martini or something like that. Okay, so here's something that could not happen. It couldn't be like the president of the union says, "Find me Mr. Martini, bring him to me." It couldn't happen that his cronies go out and report back and say, "Okay, it turns out we found Mr. Martini, but he wasn't drinking a martini,"
Mhm.
or we found the guy drinking a martini, but he's not Mr. Martini at all. So
Right. Yeah.
that couldn't happen, right? Because like the drinking of the martini is like necessary for being Mr. Martini, and it's sufficient for being Mr. Martini. If you're the guy drinking a martini at this party, you're Mr. Martini.
You're Marty
Uh,
Martini. Congrats.
yeah. So some names clearly have that kind of essential information, and I think
And that relates to
probably
the idea of dominance, right? And you get into more nuance in the paper that dominance isn't just like the total number concerning
yeah,
information,
yeah.
right? There's other factors that are relevant here for determining what that means. Yeah. Mhm.
Yes. So similarly, if somebody said, "Oh, we found out who Jesus Christ was. He was a mushroom. He was a psychedelic mushroom," I think the right response is, "Okay, what you're telling me is there was no Jesus. There was just this other thing called Jesus." Um, yeah, but like I would not take myself to have been referring to a mushroom the whole time. I wouldn't have, because it's like it's an essential part of the name using practice that what we're referring to is a person.
Yeah, wherever
Okay,
the
so
limits are, we're clearly over them at the
okay,
mushroom
so
point, right?
similarly, so maybe that's what's gone wrong with the Mormons, like at least the ones who subscribe to. I think it's like I don't know if there is an official version of Mormon theology, but if there is, I thought it was something like the person that they're calling Elohim. Okay, there is no such person, but they take themselves to be referring to a person with names like Elohim and Heavenly Father, but he's just sort of like a promoted man. He's an elevated man. He as man is, he once was. Um, he lives on a planet near the star Kolob. He's married, has spirit babies, etc. So when you hear that sort of thing, it might be like, and then you're told, well, if Mormonism's true, that's what your use of God is referring to. So when you're told something like that, like if Mormonism's true and you're using the name God, you're referring to Heavenly Father. You're referring to Elohim, this elevated man made of matter who lives on a planet. I think that is a bit like being told, look what we've
Jesus is a
discovered.
mushroom.
Jesus is
Yeah,
a mushroom.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm
And I
with
think
you.
the right response is, sorry, no. Like it just couldn't be.
It's over the
Um,
line. Mhm.
yeah, it's overly. Okay, so yeah, maybe I got yeah. So there's two ways to try to argue that Mormons are not worshiping God or referring to God with the divine names, but Muslims, Christians, and Jews are. One way is try to point to a difference in the nature of the storytelling that Joseph Smith was involved in, as opposed to Muhammad. The other way is to say, no, there's this like sine qua non information that's absolutely essential information that Mormons are violating. Yeah, so I guess that's the thing to do. I don't, yeah,
Yeah.
and I guess maybe somebody could say something similar with Islam and say, look, it's absolutely essential that God be triune. Yeah, I guess that's also going to rule that Jews are not referring to God.
Yeah, implications, right? But isn't
And
it there's certain things we say absolutely essential of Jesus too, right?
yeah, well, like I guess there's a difference between like properties without which the thing could not exist, compared to properties without which like the name could not refer.
Mm,
Yeah, and sometimes those are the same, but I guess sometimes those are different. Oh, but that's highly speculative. Okay, but in any way, I would have thought it's not essential to the name God applying to something that that thing be triune. So, given that God exists and God is a Trinity, like there's no way God could have not been triune. I think that's right. Okay, but I
right.
guess this be like a more conceptual possibility as opposed to a
It's a
metaphysical.
real ontological one, right? I mean, think of people that bring up the Superman, right? I take it that Clark Kent is essentially an alien, right?
Yeah, that is part of the story, I think. Yeah. And he's not part of this species. He doesn't have the right ancestry to be a human. So yeah, he's like essentially not a human. But yeah, imagine yourself in the story. Like it was a conceptual possibility that is human. In fact, people thought he was human. Yeah. And the name still applied. So even if it had turned out, you could put it this way. This is a way of like expressing epistemic or conceptual possibilities. Like it could turn out that Clark Kent is human. Yeah. And then the name would still apply to him. Even though from a metaphysical perspective, like there's no way he could have been human given that he's an alien. Yeah, so I guess we're just expressing when we're wondering whether words apply, we're thinking of like conceptual possibilities. We're wondering whether the concept applies, and so I guess we think of conceptual possibilities. Okay, so I'm just saying, I think
That's
it
the
is
direction I would go. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would have thought it's conceptually possible that God not be triune, even though it's not metaphysically possible. Okay, but I would have thought it's not even conceptually possible that God be an elevated man made of matter who lives on a planet, etc. Yeah, so maybe that's the difference. All right. Hope this is interesting to some viewers.
That's great. No, I like where we explored here. I think that's got to be something in that direction. Is the right account, right? Yeah. I'm too lazy to figure it out.
Yeah, you're like Saul Kripke. A little too lazy at the moment.
Corn. You wanted. You said don't let you forget corn, so I'm not letting you forget.
I was going to talk about corn and Vatican II. Because as I said, like I'm just kind of not sure whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God, but Vatican II kind of seems quite sure about it. And I am sure that I'm Catholic, and I am sure that I believe everything in the magisterium. Yeah, everything the church teaches is true, and it sure looks like the church is trying to teach that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. So what's going on there? So I've got like two thoughts in my head, and maybe you can correct me, my friend. Help me see the light here. But one possibility is, so what a name refers to, what a word refers to, is going to it's going to in large part be an empirical question, because it's going to depend on the history of the name and the way the name is being used. So like when we described what happened to the name Madagascar, we had to tell you about like certain historical events. Like here's what happened in Marco Polo's head, as a matter of fact. And then here's what happened in the name using practice. Like the followers of Marco Polo started to dominate the name using practice as opposed to the original users of the word Madagascar. Okay, so reference is largely a historical matter. Okay, so it's an empirical matter. Like you got to actually investigate the world to figure out what a name refers to. Okay, and so it could be that a name is used by some people in one way, or a word more generally is used by one community with a certain reference, but that same word with the same like ancestry is used by a different community in a different way. So here's an example that I thought of, and I'm pretty sure this is right. So I think the word corn is a good example, because the British use it in one way, in a way that I think maybe it's been corrupted recently. It's come to be more like the American way. But in America, in the United States, we definitely use it to refer to like a particular kind of grain, right? That comes from a particular kind of grain. Oof, I don't know why I said grant. It comes from a particular kind of plant. That's what I was trying to do. I mixed up grain and plant. Yeah. Okay, so that's what we refer to as corn. Whereas, like, I maybe you've noticed this in Lord of the Rings as well. Like Tolkien likes to use a kind of antiquated sense of words, and I think even in contemporary British English, corn just kind of means like grain generally. So it could be barley, it could be maybe wheat, it could be rye. Like any kind of grain counts as a kind of corn.
Sure.
Okay. So again, I guess I don't know if, as a matter of fact, that's how things stand now. Maybe they've been influenced by us and changed the way they use the word. But I think this was the way the word was used. And that's because, like, if you trace back that word, it comes from an Old English word, an Anglo-Saxon word. And I think it's just corn. I think that's the word. And that definitely meant just grain generally. They didn't know about maize. They didn't. That's like a North American plant, so they didn't have that kind of grain, but they still used the word corn. Okay, so there we have one word, corn, that kind of branched, and in two contemporaneous communities living at the same time, one of them uses the word with one reference, like more generally, we're referring to any kind of grain. The other community uses it more specifically to mean a particular kind of grain. Okay, so that can happen. So maybe something similar could happen with the divine names. Even if you've got two communities existing at the same time, and they're both using the same word, and these words have the same ancestry, it could be that one group is using the name to refer to something that's more general, and one word is using the name or the word to refer to something that's more specific. So it could be that there are linguistic communities out there that use the name God in a more general way to just mean creator, all-powerful. It's like something quite general. It's not super specific.
Yeah. The source of everything, apart from itself.
Whereas another community is using it in a more specific way, like includes information about the Trinity, let's say. Okay, so that could happen. And so when Vatican II says Muslims and Christians both adore the one God or whatever, they could just be using the word as part of a linguistic community that uses the word God in a more general way. Right. Whereas there are other linguistic communities where that sentence would not express a true proposition. So, for example, if like the Brits said, I'm going to make some whiskey out of corn or something like that, they might mean barley.
Yes.
Whereas if you had said that same sentence in American English and you're like loading barley into the vat, what you have said in American English is false. If you're like, I'm making whiskey out of corn, putting barley in the vat. Yeah. So you can see how like the same sentence could be used to express a truth in one linguistic community, but not in another linguistic community.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so maybe that's what happened. So what I would say is, so here's one thing that somebody who believes that Christians and Muslims don't really worship the same God, and they want to be good Roman Catholics, they could say, I admit that the authors of Vatican II were using the word God in a more general way, and the proposition that they mean to express is true. Muslims and Christians do both worship the creator, omnipotent, all-powerful,
the uniquely unique, transcendent. Yes, right.
Yeah, that's what they meant to say. And in fact, they like spelled out what they meant. And so, yeah, that's what they meant to say. And that's true. Nevertheless, in these parts, this person might say, we use the word God in a more specific way, so that Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God. So that could happen. So that's one way to like reconcile the claim that Muslims and Christians don't worship the same God with the teachings of Vatican II. Okay, another way is to say, okay, and this is speculative. You should ask a good cradle Catholic theologian. Cradle Catholic theologian. That's what you need.
I am not. So
okay. What really counts as what counts as infallible, I should say. So we know that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, okay, that's infallible. When the Pope's just speaking kind of off the cuff, not so infallible. If the Pope writes an encyclical, that is part of the ordinary magisterium. It kind of requires religious assent, but it's not considered infallible. If it repeats something that is said in very many different places, then it gets elevated to like ordinary universal magisterium, I think. Okay, but the extraordinary magisterium, the infallible stuff, is when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, and when church councils, ecumenical councils, issue canons or official proclamations that are on matters of faith and morals. Okay, so that's like that's a requirement.
An important qualification. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's got to be on matters of faith and morals. And so, question: when Vatican II tells you something about the reference of words, like that Muslims are using the divine names to refer to God, is that a matter of faith and morals? So, on the one hand, we don't just want to say this. Well, look, reference is largely a historical matter. Matters of history are not matters of faith or morals. So when Vatican II talks about reference, it couldn't be part of the extraordinary magisterium. We don't want to say that because there are some matters of faith that are historical, like that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Right.
Right?
Died, rose again. Yeah, right.
Yeah, he died, rose. Okay, there's a whole lot in the creed that's historical. Became man, etc. Okay, so we don't just want to say because it's historical, because it's empirical, it couldn't be a matter of faith. We don't want to say that. So I looked into it. I looked into it just a little bit more, and I think what I found was, in order for something to count as a matter of faith, it's got to be the Pope or the church councils have to either be clarifying or repeating something that's taught in sacred scripture or something that's taught in like sacred tradition. And I think that this claim about the reference of divine names in the mouths of Muslims is neither. It's not part of sacred scripture, and I don't think it's part of sacred tradition. So it's kind of seeming to me now, this is totally revisable. Could be wrong about this, but it seems like that is not a matter of faith and morals. So it couldn't be part of the extraordinary magisterium. So you don't have to think it's infallible in order to be a good Catholic. Still, it's like taught by a church council, so it might be part of the ordinary magisterium and requires like religious assent. But somehow that kind of assent is compatible with not thinking that it's infallible. Okay, so that's what I'm thinking these days. What do you know about this, Pat?
Very little, in fact, because I've spent very little time worrying about this question. For better or worse, I'm one of those people who just thought, oh yeah, this is obvious, right? Or at least super plausible that the answer to this question is yes. And I would say the thing that gave me the most pause about it was your paper, and these considerations of shift or drift.
Yeah.
There's but the historical, I mean, look, at the end of the day, I'm a Catholic. I think the church is a reliable authority, particularly epistemic authority. And that these matters are hard. They're hard philosophically, they're hard historically. So like, even if I can't totally adjudicate it along those lines, what's my posture? It's just to go with what the church teaches, right? Unless I have like some super pressing, overriding reason to reject it, right?
And I guess it's just worth repeating something that Roman Catholics often say in these conversations is like, again, just even if Muslims do manage to refer to God, they're saying a whole lot of false and frankly dangerous things about God, things that could compromise one's salvation, easily compromise one's salvation, and probably do compromise one's salvation. So it's not like when we say Christians and Muslims worship the same God, it's not as if that's to say, so Muslims are looking good salvation-wise or something like that.
That they have, that they're equally on the same sort of level of truth or anything like that. No, that's
and I think
definitely
I think Christians have to say that whatever happened on that so-called mountain of light when Muhammad got these revelations, it wasn't God and it wasn't an angel. So
somebody playing for the other team, right?
Either it was purely a psychological kind of phenomenon or it was a malicious supernatural entity. So I think that's what Christians have to say.
But yeah, I mean, you can still pick up a successful reference from a malicious entity, right?
Yeah. I think so. In the recent debate on that Capturing Christianity channel, Trent Doherty and Chris Tomaszewski, who, hope I said that right, had a debate, and I think one of them, I think it was Trent, said something like this. Like, just think about the story in the Garden of Eden when Satan starts talking to Eve about God and says, like, did he really say those things? Did God really tell you not to eat of this tree or whatever? So even like in the mouth of Satan, like the divine names can refer to God.
That's a good point.
So, I mean, and that's as bad as it gets. Like, being Satan is as bad as it gets.
So you ain't going any lower than that, right?
So even Satan can refer to God. So, and by saying that, like, Satan and we are talking about the same God, that's obviously not to like condone Satan, or say that Satan's looking good salvation wise. He's not. He's just saying a lot of false things about the one true God. Okay, so yeah, similarly with Muslims. I was just going to say this other thing really quick
Please.
about the possibility of reference shift, just to muddy the waters a little more, complicate the issues a little more. To give you a kind of more concrete example of how this might happen. I don't know if I mentioned this in the paper or not, but imagine like when the Israelites are wandering through the desert and Moses is up on Mount Sinai, and then while he's gone, the Israelites clamor for an idol, and they say, "Aaron, please make us an idol so that we can worship the idol." And then when Aaron melts down all the gold and makes the golden calf, he presents it to the Israelites, and interestingly and importantly says, "This is the God that brought you out of Egypt." Okay, and so they're worshiping this, and it looks like they're worshiping this idol, this calf, as Yahweh, right? They seem to think that this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. So they might have even used like divine names to refer to that golden calf.
Did they actually use divine names referring to it,
So
or was it just this?
text. Yeah, well, I think in the text we're just told, "Here is the God that brought you out of Egypt." So I'm just imagining,
extension, or yeah.
So I'm just imagining, like, how did things go from there? And it seems like it may well have happened that they started using divine names to refer to the calf, right? They're told this is the God that brought us out of Egypt. They know that that God is Yahweh. And so they might be saying, like, let's go worship Yahweh. Yahweh is a little bit smudged. We should clean Yahweh. Yeah, Yahweh is made out of my bracelet, partly out of my bracelet that I melted down. So it may well have happened that they started using the divine names to refer to the golden calf. Okay, so then it's very much like the Madagascar case.
Yeah, totally.
So
right.
they intend to use the name as it's been used. They just mistakenly think that golden calf is Yahweh. So they don't mean to like initiate a new name using practice and say, "I hereby dub the golden calf Yahweh. I recognize now the name is ambiguous," in the way that like children's names become ambiguous. Like this kid is named Robert, that kid's named Robert, that kid is named Robert. We realize like Robert is just ambiguous now and refers to many different things. So they weren't doing that. They weren't trying to introduce ambiguity. They really thought like this is Yahweh. Okay, so I think that the thing to say is at first, this is blasphemy, right? They're saying a lot of false things about God. They're saying like Yahweh's over there, Yahweh's made out of gold. We're bowing to Yahweh. So they're saying a lot of false things about God. That's blasphemy. I think at first that's the right way to describe it. They are saying false things about God. They're saying like Yahweh's over there, Yahweh's made of gold. These are false things. Yahweh is not over there. Yahweh is not made out of gold. But then eventually in this name using practice, once the dossier becomes corrupted with information that's not false information about God, but false information about that idol, eventually the name would shift reference to the idol. Okay, so this could all happen kind of like accidentally on the part of the Israelites. They didn't mean for the name to shift reference, but it did. So that I just wanted to say and emphasize that is the danger of blasphemy. If you say enough false things about God, eventually you won't even be talking about God anymore. You will lose contact with God.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
You'll lose linguistic contact with God, and you'll just start talking. And if we were to do it, it would just shift to a creature of fiction. We would just be talking about something that doesn't exist. In the case of the Israelites, they started talking about this idol. So it didn't shift to fiction, it shifted to an idol. Okay, so the point of all this is just what makes me kind of unsure about whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God is, from the Christian perspective, Muslims have been doing something like this, like what the Israelites were doing, for centuries now. So what succeeded in shifting the referent of Madagascar in just like a few decades, or maybe a couple centuries, and what succeeded in shifting the reference of the name Santa Claus in just a few decades, or maybe a century, has been happening in Islam for centuries. And so, gosh, maybe the reference shifted. They've been saying false things about God for a really long time. And we know that eventually that's going to shift the reference of a name. And so maybe that has happened. Yeah. Okay. Can I just say one more thing, and then maybe
no, this is great. Yeah, please.
Okay, so in the paper, what I propose is like a test to see like whether Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And the test is just to like run a couple counterfactuals through your head.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the case of a clear reference shift like Santa Claus, we know that this is what happens. So a kid who's raised in the Santa Claus cult, in the contemporary American lies about Santa Claus, where they're told he lives at the North Pole, he has a
Flying
fleet of
reindeer.
elves, yeah, flying reindeer. Okay, when a kid is raised on those sorts of lies, if we were to tell the kid, look, there is no jolly Nordic elf who's making presents, who flies around the world every Christmas Eve. There's nothing like that. But there was this very nice Saint Nicholas who was like a bishop and did a lot of really good things. When we tell those facts to the kids, I think they rightly conclude, so what you're telling me is there is no Santa Claus. There is just this other guy, Saint Nicholas.
Yeah,
I think
right.
yeah,
Right.
so that's what we tell kids. Like we realize we have to tell kids there is no Santa Claus. We're not telling them you're radically mistaken about Saint Nicholas. We don't say that. We say there just is no Santa Claus. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
what makes it clear that it's a case of reference shift, because
Mm-hmm.
we kind of run the facts by them and we say, look, imagine, accept that things are like this. Your Santa Claus myth is false. The Saint Nicholas facts are true. Does Santa Claus exist? And the right answer is no. Okay, so
Right.
we can do a similar kind of test in both directions with Christians and Muslims. We can run a similar kind of test. So imagine as a Christian, so this is a counterfactual. I'm not saying this is the
Mm-hmm.
way things actually are, but just imagine that Islam is true and Christianity is false. Okay, so Jesus is not the Son of God, never died, didn't rise from the dead, no Trinity, Muhammad's a real prophet. Okay, so just entertain without assenting to the proposition that Islam is true. Just think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and now ask yourself, in that situation, does God exist? Is it the case that like God exists, he's just very different from what I thought he was like? Or have you learned now on this supposition that there is no God, there's just this other thing, Allah?
Right. What sort of result do you get? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what sort of results do you get? So I think that if you get the former result that like, okay, well, God still exists, he's just really different from what I thought. He's not a Trinity at all, and Jesus is not the Son of God. If you get that result, then you should conclude, okay, Christians and Muslims worship the same God.
Mm-hmm.
If, on the other hand, you think, okay, what I would have learned in that situation is there is no God at all. There's just this other being, Allah. Then you should conclude Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God. Okay, then Muslims can do a similar test in the reverse direction.
Mm-hmm.
What if Christianity is true and Islam's false? Would Allah still exist? Yeah. Okay, and you get similar kind of results. And just, I don't know, again, just to return to the Mormonism thing, I think that if I found out that there is no omnipotent, eternal creator of everything
There's just
who's
some giant material
immaterial.
thing.
Yeah, there's just rather always been matter, and there's always been this plan of salvation, or whatever the Mormons call it, this eternal progression thing where humans get elevated to godhood. And so there's like actually a plethora of there's infinitely many, I guess, on this view. There's infinitely many elevated humans who are kind of like Zeus-like characters. Does God exist? I think the answer is no.
I think the answer is
For
no.
me,
Yeah, that's the result I get. Yeah.
Turns out there's no God. We just live in a kind of weird universe that looks a little more like Greek mythology than
Right.
I thought. Yeah, there's a whole lot of Zeus-like characters floating around, but there's no God on this view.
Right.
Yeah, so that's why I'm inclined to think that Mormons and Christians don't worship the same God.
Well, that is a good test, and people will have to run it for themselves. And feel free to share the results. But I think it gets for me, it seems to get the right results in those cases. For me,
all right,
like yeah. Dr. Bogardus, this has been excellent as always. I appreciate your carefulness of thought and your demeanor, of course. And I will link your paper. It is, I know it's open access somewhere, so I would encourage people to read it because there's obviously more details in there that should be of interest to anybody who made it through this entire episode.
Yeah, if you just Google my name and go to my website, like all my papers are accessible via
Oh, cool!
links.
You have them all housed there. Excellent.
Yeah.
And I know we said at the beginning, mention some stuff you're working on, but anything else you want to tease or leave people with? You're on Twitter and stuff. It's X, sorry, whatever it is. So yeah, any plugs? Yeah. Throw them out there.
I don't know. I kind of like now. I'm thinking. I've always just have been operating with like one paper on the horizon. Like, oh, I think here's the next paper, and then I can't really see past that to the next paper.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm starting to think like I kind of want to write like a sequel to the Christians and Muslims thing and say
that would be appropriate, timely, yeah.
Well, and it wouldn't be for a few years, so I don't know if it would be timely. Like that's how long the academic publication process takes.
Yep.
But
yeah.
I don't think that previous paper settled the matter. Don't think we got to the bottom of the issue, so there's probably more to be said.
No, but it advanced the conversation, as we like to say, definitely. So
that's the goal.
Yeah, and thank you. So appreciate it. Hope everyone enjoyed this, and hopefully it clarified some things. If nothing else, you learned a little bit about different theories of reference. So if you like what we're doing here, subscribe to the show. Any last words, Dr. Bogardus?
Hey, thanks for having me on. It was good seeing you again.